Welcome to lectures in endocrinology with Dr. Piri. We continue with lecture 7. In this lecture 7, we are going to discuss the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are just on top of the kidneys, so they are also referred to as suprarenal glands because they are on top of the kidneys. The adrenal gland itself is divided into the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is further divided into three zones: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa is producing a lot of aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid. The zona fasciculata is producing a lot of glucocorticoids like cortisol and corticosterone. And the zona reticularis produces a lot of androgens. The medulla of the renal gland, they are producing more of catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So because there's a lot of information about these hormones, this lecture is going to be divided into two. So I'm going to split into two parts. The first part, I'm just going to discuss the general structure and the production of these hormones, and also the function of aldosterone hormone, which is the mineralocorticoid. And then towards the end of part 2, we are going to look at the function of glucocorticoids and also the disorders associated with these hormones. So like I said, the adrenal glands, they are also referred to as suprarenal glands because they are on top of the kidneys. The location of the adrenal glands, they are on top of the kidneys. So you can see from this diagram here that the adrenal glands, they are actually on top of the two kidneys. The adrenal cortical hormones, these are the hormones that are produced by the adrenal glands. The two adrenal glands are about 4 grams each in terms of weight. They lie at the superior poles of the kidney. So they are found on the superior poles of the kidneys. So you have two, each weigh about 4 grams. Each gland is composed of adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla secretes catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to sympathetic stimulation. So they are released by neuronal mechanism of hormone release. For them to be released, you need sympathetic stimulation. The sympathetic nerve will be stimulating the adrenal medulla to release a lot of catecholamines, the epinephrine and norepinephrine. The adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids, cortisol, hydrocortisone, and mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. These are produced by the adrenal cortex. This is a diagram of the adrenal gland that is divided into the cortex and the medulla. So we have the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla at the center of the adrenal cortex. The two major hormones of adrenocortical hormones, the two types of adrenocortical hormones. What are the two types? We have the mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids that are secreted by the adrenal cortex. In addition to these, small amounts of sex hormones are secreted, especially the androgenic hormones. So the androgens, they are also secreted by the cortex. The mineralocorticoids, the major one is aldosterone. Aldosterone is the principal mineralocorticoid. Affect the electrolytes, the minerals, hence the name mineralocorticoids, of the extracellular fluid, sodium and potassium in particular. So it will have an effect on sodium and potassium concentrations in particular. Because it has got an effect on these electrolytes, is referred to as mineralocorticoid. Then we have glucocorticoids. An example is cortisol. Cortisol is the principal glucocorticoid. It exhibits important effects that increase blood glucose concentration. From the name itself, glucocorticoids, it has got an effect on glucose or carbohydrates, proteins, and fat as well. It has additional effects on both protein and fat metabolism that are equally as important to the body function as their effects on carbohydrate metabolism. The glucocorticoids, they also have an effect on protein and fat metabolism. The mineralocorticoids mainly has got an effect on the electrolytes, sodium, potassium. The production and secretion of adrenocortical hormones. the production and secretion of adrenocortical hormones. The adrenal cortex has three distinct layers. The zona glomerulosa is the outermost layer that lies just underneath the capsule, constitutes about 15% of the adrenal cortex. Cells are the only ones in the adrenal gland capable of secreting significant amount of aldosterone because they contain the enzyme aldosterone synthase. The cells in the zona glomerulosa, they are the ones that contain the enzyme aldosterone synthase, which is responsible for the production of aldosterone. So much of the aldosterone is produced by the zona glomerulosa, because this is where you find the enzymes that are responsible for the production of aldosterone. The secretion of these cells is controlled mainly by extracellular fluid concentration of angiotensin II and potassium, especially potassium levels, then angiotensin II. The secretion of aldosterone is affected by angiotensin II and potassium. If you have an increase in potassium levels, you will produce a lot of aldosterone that will exchange potassium for sodium. Then if you have angiotensin II in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis, you know to say that the angiotensin II can also increase the production and secretion of aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa. So those are the stimulus, or the two stimuli that will stimulate the release and secretion of aldosterone, the production and secretion. The zona fasciculata, the middle and widest layer, constitutes about 75% of the adrenal cortex, and it produces glucocorticoids cortisol and corticosterone. Cortisol and corticosterone is produced by the zona fasciculata, which is the middle part of the cortex. Small amounts of adrenal androgens and estrogens could be produced again by the zona fasciculata, but much of the androgens are produced by the zona reticularis. Secretion of these cells, the secretion of these cells is controlled in large part by the hypothalamic pituitary axis via the adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenocorticotropic hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland is the one that will go and stimulate the production of glucocorticoids and androgens to some extent. Remember, the hypothalamus is producing corticotropin releasing hormone that will be transported to the pituitary gland to secrete to stimulate the production of adrenocorticotropin hormone that will be transported again by the cardiovascular system to the adrenal cortex to stimulate the zona fasciculata to increase the production and secretion of glucocorticoids, cortisol and corticosterone, and to some extent the production of androgens as well. The zona reticularis lies deep in the cortex, so it's the deeper layer of the cortex. So it's the deeper layer of the cortex is going to produce androgens. Dehydroepiandrosterone is the hormone that is being produced here, but this is just a precursor of other hormones, so it doesn't have much effect on the body. The dehydroepiandrosterone, and it also produces androstenedione as well as small amounts of estrogens and glucocorticoids that are being produced by the zona reticularis, but mainly here there is production of androgens. The adrenocorticotropin hormone also regulates secretion of these cells, although other factors may also be involved in the stimulation of the zona reticularis to produce and also to release the androgens and some amount of glucocorticoids. This is the adrenal gland, the cross section of the adrenal gland. At the center you have the adrenal medulla, then the cortex that is divided into zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. From this diagram you can still appreciate that the zona glomerulosa is producing a lot of aldosterone. Aldosterone doesn't necessarily respond much to adrenocorticotropin hormone. It's responding to potassium levels and the angiotensin II. the cortisol is the one that responds more to adrenocorticotropin hormone that is being produced within the zona fasciculata. The zona reticularis is producing more of androgens. The adrenal medulla produces catecholamines, which you can appreciate here. It's the same information even in this slide. You can see the different portions of the adrenal gland. The cortex is divided into the zona glomerulosa that is producing mineralocorticoids. Examples here is aldosterone, and a bit of corticosterone is being produced by the zona glomerulosa as well. The zona fasciculata is the one that produces a lot of glucocorticoids, cortisol and cortisone. Then you have the zona reticularis that produces the androgens, estrogens and testosterone. Then we have the medulla, the adrenal medulla that produces catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and also other peptides like somatostatin and substance P that can be produced by the adrenal medulla. This is a diagram that is showing pathways in which those adrenal hormones are being produced. From the zona glomerulosa, we have the production of aldosterone. Again, from zona fasciculata, you have production of cortisol and corticosterone. Then from the zona reticularis, you have production of androstenedione. There are a number of steps that are involved in the production of these hormones, but the overall are the hormones that I'm interested in. In biochemistry, you might need to know each and every step that is involved here and the enzymes that are involved in the production of these hormones. But in physiology, just not to say that these are steroid hormones, and most of them, they are derived from cholesterol. Okay, that's enough. And you need to know which cells are producing them and their physiological function once they have been released to the circulation. The adrenocortical hormones are steroid derived from cholesterol. So they are steroids that are derived from cholesterol. In terms of production, they are produced from cholesterol. In all humans, steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. So most of these steroid hormones in human beings, mainly they are produced from cholesterol. Approximately 80% of cholesterol used for steroid synthesis is provided by low-density lipoprotein, which is a bad lipoprotein because it contains a lot of cholesterol. So if it's being used for the production of cholesterol, for the production of adrenal hormones, adrenocortical hormones, then it's a good thing because you don't want a lot of low-density lipoprotein to accumulate in the blood vessels. It can bring about atherosclerosis or hardening of blood vessels. You don't want that to happen. So it's a good thing that low-density lipoprotein are used for the production of adrenocortical hormones. The low-density lipoprotein, which have a high concentration of cholesterol, they would diffuse from the plasma into the interstitial fluid and attach to specific receptors contained in the structures called coated pits on the adrenocortical cell membrane. The adrenocortical cell membrane, they contain receptors for low-density lipoprotein. In these areas, they are called coated pits that contain receptors for low-density lipoprotein so that it can go and attach. The coated pits are then internalized by endocytosis. When low-density lipoprotein goes and binds to the receptors, they will be internalized by endocytosis, forming vesicles that eventually fuse with a rhizosome and release cholesterol that can be used to synthesize adrenal steroid hormones. The cholesterol that is contained within the low-density lipoprotein, they will be broken down by the enzymes that are found in the ribosomes. So the ribosomes will split, or they will release the cholesterol from low-density lipoprotein, and this cholesterol now will be worked on by different enzymes to convert them into adrenocortical hormones. This is what I'm talking about. So you can see we have these cells that are found in the cortex. So they are called adrenocortical cell. So you have the adrenocortical cell membrane with the coated pits. So you can see the coated pits with the receptor. Low density lipoprotein will come and bind to low density lipoprotein receptor, and to be internalized. So you can see here the interaction between low density lipoprotein and the low density lipoprotein receptor. It will be internalized by endocytosis. Then the vesicle will fuse with the lysosome to form the endosome. The endosome, now there you have enzymes from the lysosome that will break down the low density lipoprotein, releasing the cholesterol. Then the cholesterol will be released. This cholesterol now will be used by the enzymes that are found in the mitochondria and also other parts like smooth endoplasmic reticulum to produce the steroid hormones. So the steroid hormones will be produced. Of course, the receptors can be recycled. So you can see the receptors that can be recycled. So some of the receptors can be recycled. Then some of the receptors need to be produced from the rough endoplasmic reticulum, then translocated to the plasma membrane of these adrenocortical cell membrane of these particular cells. The transport of cholesterol into the adrenal cells is regulated by feedback mechanism. For example, the adrenocorticotropin hormone increases the number of adrenocortical cell receptor for low density lipoprotein. If you have an increase in the adrenocorticotropin hormone in circulation, it will go and stimulate the production of low density lipoprotein receptors within these cells in the zona fasciculata, reticularis, and zona glomerulosa. So they will be expressing a lot of receptors for low density lipoprotein. Then the increase also in adrenocorticotropin hormone is going to increase the activity of enzyme that liberate cholesterol from low density lipoprotein. So the number of enzymes that are found in the lysosomes responsible to break out the cholesterol from low density lipoprotein is also going to increase. Once the cholesterol enters the cell, it is delivered to the mitochondria where it is cleaved by enzyme cholesterol desmolase to form pregnenolone. So it will form the pregnenolone. The pregnenolone is just a precursor for the enzyme. So it will be converted, overall it will be converted into the adrenocortical hormones. It could be cortisol, it could be aldosterone, it could be androgens. So this is the rate limiting step in the eventual formation of adrenal steroids. In all the three zones of the adrenal cortex, this initial step in steroid synthesis is stimulated by different factors that control secretion of major hormone products, aldosterone and cortisol. Adrenocorticotropin hormone, which stimulates cortisol secretion, increases the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone, and also angiotensin 2, which stimulates aldosterone secretion, is going to increase the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone as well. So these are just precursors for the hormones that needs to be converted into a specific type of hormones like cortisol and aldosterone, depending on the cells that are working on the cholesterol. Aldosterone and cortisol secretion are regulated by independent mechanism. So what is going to regulate the production and secretion of aldosterone and cortisol? It's independent mechanism. They don't depend on one another. For aldosterone, you need an increase in potassium levels in the blood or an increase in angiotensin 2. The angiotensin 2 specifically increases the output of aldosterone and has no effect on other two zones. So it's going to increase the output of zona glomerulosa to increase the production of aldosterone. Then it has got no effect on the other two zones, the zona reticularis and the zona fasciculata. The adrenocorticotropin hormone that increases secretion of cortisol and adrenal androgens has little or no effect on the zona glomerulosa. So on another hand, the adrenocorticotropin hormone doesn't have much effect on the zona glomerulosa, but it will have an effect on the zona reticularis and zona fasciculata, where there is production of glucocorticoids and androgens. This table is summarizing the activities of the hormones, the glucocorticoid activity, and the mineralocorticoid activity of different hormones. The steroid hormones, we have the adrenal hormones like cortisol, corticosterone, aldosterone, deoxycorticosterone, dehydroepiandrosterone. All these hormones are produced by the adrenal cortex, and their effect, the glucocorticoid activity and mineralocorticoid activity. So you can see from this table that you have cortisol, the average plasma concentration free or bound to plasma protein. We have cortisol, that is 100 microgram per 100 milliliter of plasma. The average amount secreted in 24 hours, you have 15 milligrams. The glucocorticoid activity of cortisol is 1. The mineralocorticoid activity of cortisol is 1. So it means that cortisol can function as glucocorticoids. It will have an effect on glucose, fat, and protein, or it can function as mineralocorticoid. It has got an effect on electrolytes, especially potassium and sodium. The corticosterone, you can see that it has got glucocorticoid activity of 0.3. It's not much. Then it has mineralocorticoid activity of 15. So corticosterone is classified as mineralocorticoid to some extent because its mineralocorticoid activity is high. Aldosterone, it has got glucocorticoid activity of 0.3 and mineralocorticoid activity of 3000. So it means it's a potent mineralocorticoid hormone. So its mineralocorticoid activity is very high for aldosterone. That's why it's a major mineralocorticoid that is produced by the adrenal cortex. Deoxycorticosterone hormone, it has got glucocorticoid activity of 0.2 and mineralocorticoid activity of 100. Then you can see the other hormones like dehydroepiandrosterone. It doesn't have any glucocorticoid activity or mineralocorticoid activity, so it's a precursor that can be converted into other forms of hormones. Synthetic steroids, so these are the ones that are produced outside the body, so they are synthetic steroids, so they will also have glucocorticoid activity and mineralocorticoid activity. Cortisone, for instance, has got glucocorticoid activity and mineralocorticoid activity of 1,1, so you can see that. Prednisolone, it has got glucocorticoid activity of 4, mineralocorticoid activity of 0.5, so you can see prednisolone. So these are synthetic steroids that could be used. So that table, you can check it at your own time. So make progress. Let's look at adrenocortical hormone. Adrenocortical hormones are bound to plasma proteins in terms of transportation, because we know to say that steroid hormones are fat soluble. They don't dissolve in plasma. For them to be transported, it's logical that they bind to plasma proteins like globulin binding proteins. So you have the steroid hormones that can bind to globulin proteins, which are plasma proteins, for them to be transported. Approximately 90 to 95% of cortisol in plasma binds to plasma proteins for them to be transported, especially a globulin called cortisol binding globulin or transcortin, and to a lesser extent to albumin. So most of these cortisol, they need to bind to cortisol binding globulin for them to be transported, just like we had thyroxine. We had thyroxine binding globulin that was transporting thyroxine and also triiodothyronine. So it's the same even here. These hormones are fat soluble, so for them to be transported, they need to bind to plasma proteins. So some of these plasma proteins are cortisol binding globulin or transcortin, and to some extent they can also bind to albumin protein. This high degree of binding to plasma protein slows the elimination of cortisol from the plasma. because they are binding to plasma proteins, they will slowly be released to the tissues. So you find that the half-life for steroid hormones is going to be longer. Why? It's because it's being stored at the level of transportation, and also it will be released to the tissues. And once it's released to the tissues, it can be stored by the target cells inside, just like thyroid hormones, if you remember very well. Only about 60% of circulating aldosterone combines with plasma proteins, so that about 40% is in free form. As a result, aldosterone has a relatively short half-life as compared to cortisol, because here aldosterone, only 60% of aldosterone is binding to plasma proteins. The 40% will just exist as free form. So the free form of aldosterone can easily be used up by the tissues. Then the 60% will be slowly used up by the tissues. It will be released by the plasma proteins to the tissues. So the half-life for aldosterone is short as compared to that of glucocorticoids like cortisol. In both the combined and the free form, the hormones are transported throughout the extracellular fluid compartment. Binding of adrenal steroids to the plasma proteins may serve as a reservoir to lessen rapid fluctuations in the free hormone concentrations. Because they are binding to plasma proteins, they will slowly be released to the tissues, so this will function as a reservoir to make sure that there are no fluctuations in the free hormone concentration. So they will slowly be released to the circulation, to the target cells from the plasma proteins. The adrenocortical hormones are metabolized in the liver. Metabolism of these hormones, once they do their function, then they will be metabolized in the liver. They will be incorporated within bile, and some of it will be conjugated. Then it will be released into the circulation. Later on, it will be filtered by the kidneys and then excreted in the urine. The adrenal steroids are degraded mainly in the liver and conjugated especially to glucuronic acid and to a lesser extent sulfates. So there is conjugation of steroid hormones to glucuronic acid and also sulfates. These substances are inactive and do not have mineralocorticoid or glucocorticoids activity. After conjugation, they don't have any physiological function. About 25% of these conjugates are excreted in the bowel and then in the feces as part of the fecal material. The remaining conjugates formed by the liver enter the circulation but are not bound to plasma proteins, because now after conjugation they become water soluble, so they can easily dissolve in water. They are highly soluble in plasma and therefore filtered readily by the kidney and excreted in the urine. So this is part of the hormones that are conjugated, and then later on they will be excreted by the urine. Diseases of the liver markedly depress the rate of inactivation of adrenal hormones, and kidney disease reduce the excretion of inactive conjugates. What I mean here is that if you have any disease that is affecting the liver, then there will be less conjugation of these hormones. The excretion of these hormones will be affected, and to some extent excretion in the kidney will also be affected, because the kidney can only excrete conjugated hormones, steroid hormones. So that will have an effect also on the functions of mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. So in this part of the lecture, we'll just discuss the function of aldosterone. Then the other part, that's when we are going to discuss the function of glucocorticoids and disorders that are associated with the adrenal cortex. Mineralocorticoid deficiency causes severe renal sodium chloride wasting and hyperkalemia. It means that if you are lacking mineralocorticoid aldosterone, you're not going to be reabsorbing much of the sodium in exchange for potassium. The end result, there will be potassium that will be accumulating in the extracellular fluid compartments. Then you're not going to be reabsorbing much of the sodium. So sodium will be lost in the urine, or it will be excreted in the urine. So there will be sodium chloride wasting if you don't have the mineralocorticoids. Without mineralocorticoids, potassium ion concentration of the extracellular fluid rises markedly. Sodium and chloride are rapidly lost from the body, and the total extracellular fluid volume and blood volume become greatly reduced, because now you are losing a lot of sodium in the urine. That can also cause osmosis of water to move from the interstitium into the lumen or the kidney nephron. So the urine production is going to increase. You are losing a lot of water. That will bring about dehydration. There will be less water in the extracellular fluid, and the plasma volume will reduce. The blood volume is going to reduce greatly because of deficiency in aldosterone. The person soon develops diminished cardiac output, which progresses to a shock-like state followed by death. So because now there is less extracellular fluid volume, then the blood volume is also reducing. To say cardiac output will reduce, because if the venous return is reducing, cardiac output is going to reduce, and that will result into a shock-like state, which can be followed by death due to circulatory shock. Aldosterone is the major mineralocorticoid secreted by the adrenals. It exerts nearly 90% of the mineralocorticoid activity of the adrenal cortical secretions. But cortisol, the major glucocorticoid secreted by the adrenal cortex, also provides significant amount of mineralocorticoid activity. In as much as the mineralocorticoid activity of cortisol is 1, but the concentration of cortisol is small when you compare it to aldosterone. So it will have a significant effect on mineralocorticoid activity because of its concentration. Aldosterone's mineralocorticoid activity is about 3,000 times greater than that of cortisol, but the plasma concentration of cortisol is nearly 2,000 times that of aldosterone. So it means that even if the mineralocorticoid activity is 1, because of its concentration, it will have an effect on mineralocorticoid activity. Renal and circulatory effect of aldosterone. Aldosterone increases renal tubular reabsorption of sodium and secretion of potassium in the principal cells of the collecting tubules, and to a lesser extent in the distal tubules and collecting ducts. So in the distal tubules, collecting ducts, and also collecting tubules, you are going to find principal cells. The principal cells are the ones that are responsible because they have channels that will exchange sodium for potassium. There will be reabsorption of sodium in exchange for potassium in the principal cells. But later on, you realize to say in the intercalated cells, there is reabsorption of potassium in exchange for hydrogen ions. So if you are exchanging much of the sodium for potassium, then later on that potassium can be exchanged with hydrogen ions. So what will be the overall effect there? You'll find that there will be an increase in the levels of sodium in circulation. Then there will be less potassium because potassium is being exchanged with sodium. The net effect of excess aldosterone in plasma is to increase the total quantity of sodium in the extracellular fluid while decreasing the potassium, because the potassium is the one that is being exchanged with the sodium. Total lack of aldosterone secretion can cause loss of sodium in the urine and conservation of potassium in the extracellular fluid. So of course you are going to conserve potassium because now you don't have the aldosterone to exchange the potassium with the sodium. So you accumulate a lot of potassium in circulation. Conservation of potassium in the extracellular fluid if you don't have much of aldosterone. What is involved in the regulation of aldosterone secretion? The regulation of aldosterone secretion is intertwined with the regulation of extracellular fluid electrolyte concentrations. Extracellular fluid volume, blood volume, arterial pressure, and many special aspects of renal function. All this will have an effect on the secretion of aldosterone. The regulation of aldosterone secretion by the zona glomerulosa cells is almost entirely independent on the regulation of cortisol and androgens by the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis, a point which I have already pointed at. 4 factors are known to play essential functions or roles in the regulation of aldosterone in the probable order of their importance. They are the following. So these are the following factors that are involved in the regulation of aldosterone secretion. The first one, the most important one, is the increased potassium ion concentration in the extracellular fluid will greatly increase aldosterone secretion. So if you have hyperkalemia, the hyperkalemia will stimulate the zona glomerulosa to release a lot of aldosterone that will exchange the potassium for sodium. So that is one way of removing the potassium from the body. That's why an increase in potassium will cause an increase in the secretion of aldosterone. An increased activity of renin-angiotensin system, increased levels of angiotensin 2 also greatly increases aldosterone secretion. We all know to say renin is going to be secreted by the kidneys when blood pressure is reduced, and that renin is going to convert the angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. The angiotensinogen is produced by the liver cells. The angiotensin 1 will be transported to the liver and the kidneys, where you have angiotensin converting enzymes that will convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. The angiotensin 2 now will go to the zona glomerulosa to stimulate those cells to increase the production and secretion of aldosterone. Aldosterone secretion is going to increase under the influence of angiotensin 2. Increased sodium ion concentration in the extracellular fluid very slightly decreases aldosterone secretion. If you have an increase in sodium concentration in the extracellular fluid, you don't need a lot of aldosterone, because aldosterone is increasing the concentration of sodium. So an increase in the concentration of sodium is supposed to inhibit the secretion of aldosterone, which makes sense. So it's a more like negative feedback control mechanism, whereby an increase in sodium will inhibit the production of aldosterone. A decrease in sodium can also stimulate the production of aldosterone to some extent, so that you reabsorb much of the sodium in exchange for potassium in the kidneys. The adrenal corticotropin hormone from the anterior pituitary gland is necessary for aldosterone secretion, but has little effect in the controlling the rate of secretion. So it doesn't have much effect on the rate of secretion of aldosterone. Of these factors, potassium ion concentration in renin-angiotensin system are by far the most potent in regulating the aldosterone secretion. So these are the most important: the potassium ion concentration in renin-angiotensin system. So this is the renin-angiotensin system, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis. If there is a decrease in blood pressure due to decrease in blood volume or whatever it is, there will be an increase in the secretion of renin by the kidneys. The renin will go and convert angiotensinogen that is produced by the liver into angiotensin 1. The angiotensin 1 is going to be converted by angiotensin converting enzyme into angiotensin 2 in the lungs and also in the kidneys. The angiotensin 2 will go to the zona glomerulosa to stimulate the production of aldosterone. An increase in aldosterone, it goes to the kidneys to increase the reabsorption of sodium in exchange for potassium. Once you have reabsorption of sodium, it will create the concentration gradient, the osmotic gradient, that will facilitate osmosis to take place. So water will follow where the sodium is going. Overall, there will be reabsorption of sodium and water, and that will increase blood volume and blood pressure. And you also know the other functions of angiotensin 2. It can cause vasoconstriction, atriolar vasoconstriction, increasing the total peripheral resistance in the arterioles. If the total peripheral resistance is increasing, the blood pressure is going to increase. It can also go to the hypothalamus and stimulate the thirst centers in the hypothalamus so that it increases the fluid intake. You have this desire to take in fluids or to drink water. Once you're drinking water, you're increasing blood volume and also plasma volume. That will cause an increase in blood pressure. Then it can also enhance secretion of ADH from the posterior pituitary gland. It will stimulate the production of ADH in the hypothalamus and also secretion of ADH in the posterior pituitary gland. And you know the function of ADH. It will go to the kidneys and via V2 receptors, it will increase the translocation of aquaporins 2 to be embedded within the apical side of epithelium cells, and then there will be reabsorption of water. So you have an increase in water reabsorption, blood volume will increase, blood pressure will increase. So the secretion of aldosterone is dependent on the potassium ion concentration and angiotensin concentration. Excess aldosterone increases extracellular fluid volume and arterial pressure. This has a small effect on plasma sodium concentration. Why? It will have a small effect on plasma sodium concentration because when you are reabsorbing much of the sodium, water will also follow. That will dilute the sodium that you are reabsorbing. So you find that the effect on the sodium concentration is not that much. And at the same time, it's also stimulating the thirst center so that you drink a lot of water. So you find that the concentration of sodium in the extracellular fluid compartment is not going to increase because the reabsorption of sodium is accompanied by the reabsorption of water and also the drinking of fluids. When sodium is reabsorbed by the tubules, there is simultaneously osmotic absorption of almost equivalent amount of water that will dilute the sodium. Small increases in extracellular fluid sodium concentration stimulate the thirst centers in the hypothalamus and increased water intake. If water is available, then that can also dilute the sodium. So the concentration is not going to be affected that much when you are reabsorbing much of the sodium. Even though aldosterone is one of the body's most powerful sodium retaining hormones, only transient sodium retention occurs when excess amounts are secreted for the reasons that are mentioned above there. An aldosterone mediated increase in extracellular fluid volume lasting for more than 1 to 2 days also leads to an increase in arterial pressure. So the arterial pressure is also going to increase. So the increase in sodium retention in the body, it will also increase arterial pressure. The rise in arterial pressure then increases the kidney excretion of both water and salt. So water and salt will be excreted because of an increase in arterial pressure. Because you know to say when arterial pressure increases, the glomerular filtration rate is going to increase. So if you are reabsorbing a lot of sodium because you have an excessive amount of aldosterone, you're also going to reabsorb water. In turn, you're going to increase the arterial pressure. When the arterial pressure is increasing, the filtration at the glomerulus is also going to increase. The glomerular filtration is going to increase so that you will filter the excessive amount of water and salt. This is called pressure natriuresis and pressure diuresis. Pressure natriuresis and pressure diuresis, respectively. After the extracellular fluid volume increases above normal, arterial pressure is elevated, blood pressure retains the renal output of salt and water to normal despite the excessive or excess aldosterone. This return to normal of salt and water excretion by the kidney as a result of pressure natriuresis and diuresis is called aldosterone escape. The aldosterone escape is, by the way, the body is going to resist the symptoms or the clinical signs that is associated with an increase in aldosterone by increasing the arterial pressure and increasing the filtration of sodium and water at the same time. So sodium and water is going to be excreted. So you find that the adverse effect of aldosterone are being escaped by the body. So it's called aldosterone escape. Therefore, the rate of gain of salt and water by the body is 0, and balance is maintained between salt and water intake and output by the kidney despite continued excess of aldosterone. So this is called aldosterone escape. Aldosterone escape is the natriuresis that takes place because you are filtering a lot of sodium and you are also filtering a lot of water. The diuresis that takes place there in the kidneys because of the excessive amount of aldosterone that is increasing reabsorption of sodium and reabsorption of water, increasing the arterial blood pressure. Then you are filtering a lot of salt and water to compensate so that you don't see a lot of effect due to the excessive amount of aldosterone. So this is referred to as aldosterone escape. Conversely, when aldosterone secretion becomes 0, so now you don't have aldosterone, large amounts of salt are lost in the urine, diminishing the amount of sodium chloride in the extracellular fluid. So the concentration of sodium and chloride in the extracellular fluid is going to decrease because now you are not reabsorbing much of the sodium and chloride. The extracellular fluid volume decreases. The result is severe extracellular fluid dehydration in low blood volume, leading to circulatory shock. So without aldosterone, you can have circulatory shock that can actually cause something that I've already explained. Excess aldosterone causes hypokalemia and muscle weakness. Too little aldosterone causes hyperkalemia and cardiac toxicity because you are going to have muscle weakness. So if you have excessive amount of aldosterone, of course, we have already explained to say you're going to be exchanging potassium for sodium. So you are reabsorbing sodium in exchange of potassium. So in simple terms, you are going to have low levels of potassium. That condition is called hypokalemia and muscle weakness. In hypokalemia, it's very difficult to depolarize the nerve cells. So firing of action potentials will reduce and that can cause muscle weakness. That's why you have hypokalemia and muscle weakness. Too little aldosterone causes hyperkalemia. So it's the opposite now. The concentration of potassium is going to increase, causing hyperkalemia and cardiac toxicity. Because hyperkalemia, it will cause hyperexcitability of the nerve cells or the neurons. They'll start misfiring action potentials, and that can also cause cardiac arrhythmias or cardiac toxicity. Excess aldosterone causes loss of potassium ions from the extracellular fluid into the urine, stimulates transport of potassium from the extracellular fluid into most cells of the body. Therefore, excessive secretion of aldosterone may cause decrease in plasma potassium concentration, hypokalemia, and severe muscle weakness that will develop. Conversely, when aldosterone is deficient, the extracellular fluid potassium ion concentration can rise far above normal, which is referred to as hyperkalemia, because now it's in deficiency, so you're not exchanging potassium for sodium, so you're accumulating a lot of potassium, hyperkalemia. Serious cardiac toxicity development of cardiac arrhythmia and heart failure can result. Excess aldosterone increases tubular hydrogen ion secretion and causes mild alkalosis. So here you also need to know that if you have excessive amount of aldosterone, you are reabsorbing much of the sodium in exchange for potassium. That potassium in the intercalated disc, it will be exchanged with the hydrogen ions. So it means that you are also going to be secreting a lot of hydrogen ions. So if the body is losing a lot of hydrogen ions, that can result into mild alkalosis. So the pH of the body increases because you are losing hydrogen ions. That can cause mild alkalosis. causes secretion of hydrogen ions in exchange for sodium in the intercalated cells of the cortical collecting tubules. This decreases the hydrogen ion concentration in the extracellular fluid, causing a mild degree of alkalosis, which I've already explained. Aldosterone stimulates sodium and potassium transport in sweat glands, in salivary glands, and interstitial epithelium cells. The aldosterone will have the same effect in other cells, just like it has an effect in the kidneys. So even in other cells like the sweat glands, the salivary glands, and intestinal epithelium cells, it will increase the absorption of sodium in exchange for potassium. So it's going to increase the absorption of sodium in exchange for potassium. It will have the same effect. That's why when you're looking at GIT, the production of saliva, we say that we have the duct cells that are responsible for modification of saliva. So the aldosterone can go and stimulate the ductal cells to reabsorb much of the sodium in exchange for potassium in the saliva. When you go to the sweat glands again, it's the same. It can stimulate those duct cells to reabsorb much of the sodium in exchange for potassium, and also in the intestines it will cause absorption of sodium. So overall, aldosterone would want to retain sodium in the body. Aldosterone has almost the same effect on sweat glands and salivary glands as it has on the renal tubules. Aldosterone greatly increases the reabsorption of sodium chloride and the secretion of potassium by the ducts. The effect on the sweat glands is important to conserve body salt in the hot environment. The effect on the salivary glands is necessary to conserve salt when excessive quantities of saliva is lost. So when it's very hot, you are losing saliva, but the effect of aldosterone is to preserve the sodium so that you don't lose a lot of sodium. That sodium will help you to maintain some fluids within the body. Otherwise, if you're losing a lot of sodium, you also lose a lot of water, then you'll be dehydrated. Aldosterone also greatly enhances sodium absorption by the intestines, especially in the colon, which prevents loss of sodium in the stool. So the absorption of sodium is taking place within the colon so that you don't lose a lot of sodium in the stool or the fecal material. Conversely, in the absence of aldosterone, sodium absorption can be poor, leading to failure to absorb chloride and other anions and water as well. So you start losing water, dehydrated. The cellular mechanism of aldosterone. What is the actual mechanism of action for aldosterone? The first aldosterone diffuses readily to the interior of the tubular epithelium cells. So it will be transported by plasma proteins. So 60% is binding to plasma proteins, 40% is transported as free aldosterone to the epithelium cells of the kidney nephron. There is going to cross the phospholipid bilayer because it's fat soluble. These are steroid hormones. So it's going to cross the phospholipid bilayer to go and attach to the receptors inside the epithelium cells. So inside the epithelium cells in the cytoplasm. So it's going to bind to cytoplasmic receptors. Second, in the cytoplasm of the tubular cells, aldosterone combines with a highly specific cytoplasmic receptor. These are aldosterone receptors in the epithelium cells. Third, the aldosterone receptor complex, or a product of this complex, diffuses into the nucleus where it induces related to the process of sodium and potassium transport. One or more specific portions of the DNA to form one or more types of messenger RNA. So it's going to enhance transcription of DNA into one or more types of messenger RNA that are required for the production of specific enzymes and specific proteins that are needed for reabsorption of sodium in exchange for potassium. The messenger RNA diffuses back into the cytoplasm where operating with or in conjunction with the ribosomes, it causes protein formation, protein synthesis. The protein formed are a mixture of one or more enzymes and also membrane transport proteins that are all acting together are required for sodium, potassium, and hydrogen transport through the cell membrane. One of the enzymes especially increased in sodium potassium adenosine triphosphatase. So this is the enzyme that is involved in breaking down of ATP to transport sodium against the concentration gradient, sodium and potassium against the concentration gradient, which serves as the principal part of the pump for sodium and potassium exchange at the basolateral membrane of the renal tubular cells in the kidneys. Aldosterone does not have an immediate effect on sodium transport. Rather, this effect must await the sequence of events that leads to the formation of specific intracellular substance required for sodium transport. So here it is. This is just a summary of the mechanism of aldosterone effect. Aldosterone can be transported as bound to plasma proteins or as a free aldosterone hormone. It goes to the kidneys. It will diffuse across the capillaries, peritubular capillaries or the vasa lacta. It goes to the epithelium cells. So you can see it will move into the interstitium, then it's fat soluble. It doesn't have receptors on the plasma membrane. It's fat soluble, so it can cross the plasma membrane to enter the cell. It goes and binds to aldosterone receptors in the cytoplasm. Aldosterone receptor complex, it will diffuse to the nucleus to activate DNA enzymes that can facilitate transcription. So you have transcription of DNA into messenger RNA that will move to the ribosomes for translation of protein synthesis. Then you have protein synthesis. These proteins, they could be new channels for sodium and potassium, or they could be new pumps like sodium potassium ATPase pump, or they could be proteins modulate existing channels and pumps, or proteins that will modulate existing channels and pumps. So these could be other enzymes that are activating or inactivating these pumps that are already existing. So you can see you have a lot of sodium channels, potassium channels that will be embedded within the apical site to cause reabsorption of sodium and secretion of potassium. On the basolateral side, you have an increase in sodium potassium ATPase pump that will be pumping sodium, 3 sodium from the cell to the outside and 2 potassium from outside into the cell. There is overall reabsorption of sodium. There is overall secretion of potassium in the intercalated cells. This is the effect of aldosterone. The functions of glucocorticoids. So due to time, this is where I'm going to end the first part of the lecture. Then the functions of glucocorticoids and also the diseases affecting the adrenal cortex or adrenocortical hormones. We are going to discuss them in part 2 of lecture 7. Thank you very much.